This is the head of Hamas going on TV saying, thank you, Iran.
الجمهورية الإسلامية في إيران الذين لم يبخلوا عن هذه المقاومة بالمال وبالسلاح وبالتقنيات.
What they've decided to do was give money, ammunition, and weaponry to Hamas. That's what the Iranians do with the money we give them. So when you lift sanctions, you are funding the terrorists.
Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said Gaza is in a grave humanitarian situation.
The Iranians say the decision to lift some of the sanctions has already been made. Is that true?
We know what sanctions would need to be lifted if they're inconsistent with the nuclear agreement. But as important, and indeed more important, Iran, I think, knows what it needs to do to come back into compliance on the nuclear side.
The Secretary of State's statement is benign at best, dangerous at worst, because what it doesn't establish, what it doesn't show, is the fact that the Iranian regime is not going to stop their exporting business, and they are the largest exporter of terrorism.
Hamas is an enemy to peace and either must completely change its ways or be dismantled entirely before you could even talk of any solution to this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians.
The immediate risk is to Israeli security. So why are we helping to fund rockets that are flying into Israel?
Keep in mind, Hamas is a terrorist organization that doesn't accept any peace with Israel. Not two states, not one state. It seeks our destruction. It's a jihadist, genocidal organization.
Even when they are saying a statement like we just heard in Arabic, and I cannot but thank those who brought forth money and weaponry to the valiant resistance, the Biden administration is willing to continue now round 5 of these negotiations. The anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States, not just anti-Israel, but anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, is unreal.
New details on a just brutal attack on a Jewish man in Times Square. Police arrested a man in his 20s for the beating that happened as pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian protesters clashed last night.
He hit me with crutches, hit me with like flagpoles.
Joseph Borgen says he hadn't even made it to a pro-Israel protest in Times Square before he was brutally beaten by a group of pro-Palestine protesters. He says he was targeted and followed the minute after he left a train station. He says the attackers peppered him with anti-Semitic slurs.
We're going to kill you. We're going to kill Israel.
We have actually appeared at the UN. I addressed a General Assembly meeting on the whole boycott, divest, and sanction movement and the anti-Semitism that now we're seeing on the streets of New York City and other cities around the country.
The goal is unambiguous. The intent is clear. It is to create an environment so hostile that those students of you that are here today would be afraid to say the word, I am a Zionist. I am a Jew. Never, never, on the memory of our families, should we allow that to take place, and the least in the United States of America.
People say BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. How come is it that you automatically mean Israel? There are so many countries in the world which really deserve to be boycotted, divested, sanctioned.
We shouldn't forget, people think that boycott, divestment, and sanctions might not be the biggest deal, that when the Nazis came to power, the first thing that they did was set a boycott of Jewish businesses.
This idea that we're going to make this a partisan issue is very dangerous for Israel. It shouldn't be an issue that we have to debate.
We have a petition at the ACLJ right now that says stop funding Israel's enemies. So it's not what you can do as an individual, it's collectively we can actually do a lot.
Reports about previously undisclosed U.S. intelligence are adding ammunition to the theory that the coronavirus may have escaped from a laboratory.
In February, a Western intelligence official told NBC News the U.S. has substantial intelligence that has not been made public about the actions the Chinese government took related to the Wuhan lab. 3 researchers at a Wuhan lab fell ill and even went to the hospital right before the pandemic began.
This is May of 2020, so last year. This is what Dr. Fauci said about the origins of the COVID-19 virus.
It's very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
This is May of this year, this month.
So I wanted to ask, are you still confident that it developed naturally?
No, I'm not convinced.
What happened in that intervening year to make the change?
Reports started leaking out. That's what happened.
Nothing has really changed except he was exposed, and so now he is covering himself.
Every piece of evidence that we have seen in that year suggests that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is the place from which this virus leaked.
Unfortunately, you have Jen Psaki. This is, her whole response is, it's all about the World Health Organization.
An international investigation led by the World Health Organization is something that we've actually been pressing for several months.
Couldn't the Biden administration put more pressure on China to get a more a reliable investigative team, whether it was made up of Americans and people from other countries, but maybe outside the WHO?
The WHO doesn't have the capacity to get the answers that are needed. It's going to take real state power to convince the Chinese Communist Party to cooperate.
How about the president picks up the phone and says, you know what? Now we're finding out that this thing looks like it was intentionally made in your labs. We need to know everything. Because you know who we are? We're the United States of America, your largest trading partner. The Biden administration, now think about this for a moment, folks, shuts down the very investigation that was already ready to issue its final findings.
New reports have surfaced that Biden's team shut down a closely held State Department effort launched late in the Trump administration to prove the virus originated in a Chinese lab.
And yet the administration comes in and says, don't issue those findings. We're not satisfied with those findings, which means they didn't like what they were going to find.
This new intel report about the Wuhan lab workers becoming sick is fueling more questions about the origin of the coronavirus. Senator Mike Braun tells me about a year ago, he and others were ridiculed after they brought up the idea that the virus might have been made up in a lab.
A year later, all evidence points to that that's exactly what happened. And the Biden administration, and this is what people need to really understand, the Biden administration shuts down the very investigation that already had come to its draft conclusions.
It does look like the administration was on the verge of saying this is the most likely scenario. And I would tell you this. The American people deserve to know that because of how China handled the response to that. They need to know, and the rest of the world needs to know how to respond to China.
Now that more circumstantial evidence is emerging, such as the Wall Street Journal report that 3 researchers at the lab were hospitalized with COVID-like symptoms back in late 2019, many news outlets are playing catch-up.
We need to have our congressional leaders asking these questions. Why shut down one investigation? The only answer that's acceptable is that we have better information in another angle.
It's a legal problem and it's a political problem. The legal problem is you had an investigation that was ongoing that already had come to a draft conclusion. And then the political problem is they stop it before it's released.
After a meeting with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, the Secretary of State also announced the reopening of the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, a move that restores ties with the Palestinians.
They've also been rewarded not just with cash, but with a new consulate in Jerusalem.
Diplomatic representation specifically for Palestinians, which was closed by President Trump. There was a commitment to help in the rebuilding of Gaza after the 11-day war, and a new package of funding for the UN and the Palestinian Authority.
By doing this move, and former Ambassador David Friedman has said the same thing, there's actually a violation of law here.
It's the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which was passed in 1995, and as we've covered on this broadcast before, it was ignored by multiple administrations of both political parties.
Setting up consulate for a foreign entity in Israel's capital city, I mean, it's unheard of. No other place in the world do we have a consulate to a foreign entity in a capital.
What was most telling in his meetings was what Secretary Blinken didn't say. No mention of pushing towards a two-state solution, no mention of a peace process. It's clear that the Biden administration wants to put a lid on this conflict, but for now doesn't want to attempt to actually solve it.
A consulate that is just going to be a dividing point for an already tense situation, and a consulate that is given as a reward for bad behavior.
And so the question needs to be asked of the Biden administration. When you open up a consulate in Jerusalem, are you saying that the embassy is not based in Jerusalem? You can't have it both ways.
The idea that we're rewarding the Palestinian Authority, which is who you're rewarding here, with this diplomatic recognition, which people seem to ignore, but that's what it is, sets a very bad precedent.